Good morning. I'm Mary Moglia-Cannon, your service leader. I'm joined by Jeremy Johnchick on AV. In honor of Women's History Month, UUEA celebrates Harriet Tubman, a fearless and determined woman who escaped enslavement and became one of the most extraordinary conductors of the Underground Railroad. We are pleased to be joined by Saladin Allah, Community Liaison at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. A few housekeeping items. We will resume coffee hour next week, so you're going to want to show up. Those people on Zoom, you're going to want to show up. Today is our first Sunday where masks are actually optional. So how great is it that we are well enough to be together in person and to see each other's faces? Please take a moment to stand, embody your spirit, and greet your neighbor. Welcome all members, friends, and visitors to UU of East Aurora. This is a community in which all people are welcomed, regardless of belief systems, ethnicities, race, gender, sexual orientation, or economic standing. We, the UUs in the house, often choose to push ourselves out of our comfort zone, and we try to recognize discomfort as evidence that we're growing. Good morning, Snyders. You missed the hello without masks. Today, if you feel discomfort arise within you, we invite you to practice being curious and to allow your discomfort to lead you to new learning. To those who are new here as visitors, welcome to a safe space. Are there any announcements before we begin?
Hi, I'm Rich Moglia-Cannon. I'm the chair of the board, and I wanted to give you a little bit more board news. So next week is Stewardship Sunday, and we're going to do something a little bit different. We're not going to have a Zoom hybrid service next week because would be too hard to pull off filming the skit. So if you want to see several of us make fools of ourselves, you will have to show up in person. We're also going to have food for lunch to open up our coffee hour, so that might be worth the trip by itself. So anyway, we're slowly relaxing our safety precautions, but we're keeping an eye on the statistics just in case we have an upturn. But everything's looking very good right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. So I have a couple of announcements. First, due to the U.S. flag regulations and flagpole height, we can only have 2 flags on our pole. So no worries, we did not get rid of the pride flag. One of the flags has to be a U.S. flag. So please know that our pride flag is not gone. It's just temporarily replaced with the Ukrainian flag to show solidarity with its people. A new progressive pride flag will be raised before June. Hopefully well before June. Second, I have a final tally from our treasurer for the food equity campaign. We raised a total of $4,960 as a congregation. Thank you all for coming out in force. 21 people participated. This is phenomenal for a 3-week campaign. We're very grateful. Thank you so much. And so what this means to anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, and you won't hear about it again, is that combined with a match, we are at $10,000. That is a total of 16 farm shares. 15 of those farm shares will join a larger food equity effort by the Michigan Street Corridor to bring fresh organic vegetables to the folks of Buffalo's East Side for 19 weeks on a first-come, first-served basis so that there is no waste, and to ensure that many people are able to participate. So in addition to veggie pickup, I learned that there will be community events, nutrition education, recipe cook-offs, and an internship offered to someone who wants to pursue a career around food and nutrition. So if we can get down to one of those events this summer, that might be fun. The additional share for UUEA will be split into sample shares. If you are a member and you are interested in applying for free vegetables for 19 weeks, please know that your application will be confidential. There will be details in the upcoming newsletter on how to apply. And my last announcement is about Tuesday, March 15th, from 7 p.m. to 8:30. If you have availability and interest, the UUA, the National UU Association, and Standing on the Side of Love, in conjunction with the Trevor Project, will host a Zoom for strategies to combat the many anti-transgender bills moving through state legislatures. These bills propose banning participation in sports, access to gender-appropriate bathrooms, or criminalization of gender-affirming health care. To date, in 2022, 6 known trans murders have occurred, 5 of which are trans women of color. If your passion is fighting oppression and you have 90 minutes on Tuesday, I encourage you to please register for it. The link is on our Facebook page. I'll be on the call, and I'd be happy to debrief with anyone who wants to figure out how we at UUA can get a letter writing campaign or phone banking campaign going. And I just want to say one other thing. Remember that these are the same states that are banning books, that are banning accurate U.S. history education. So this is oppression for every single one of us. Thank you. I begin this service by acknowledging that our nation was largely built on the ancestral land of Native nations and the stolen labor of enslaved peoples. May we persevere to achieve a clear understanding of our shared past and utilize these lessons learned for good and for progress. Our prelude, We Are, was written and performed by Dr. Barnwell at the UUA General Assembly.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth, keepers of faith, makers of peace, and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star sings to the universe who we are. We are one.
As I light the chalice, please join me in saying the chalice lighting words printed on the order of service. We light this flame as a beloved people, united in love and thirsting for restorative justice. May it melt away the tethers that uphold whiteness as superior. May it spark a spirit of humility. May it ignite a radical love that transforms into purposeful action. This is a chalice of audacious hope, shining a light on our shared past, signaling our intention to listen deeply, reflect wisely, and act boldly towards our highest ideals. Our opening words, performed by Elina Vernon, were first delivered extemporaneously at the 1851 Ohio Women's Rights Convention by abolitionist and women's rights activist Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a woman?
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negro rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? When that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say.
The offertory is a moment in our service to remind us that UUEA cannot do anything without members and friends showing up and supporting each other. Sincere thanks to those who participate in events, volunteer their time, share their talents, or are in a position to be generous. If you are inclined to give, you may donate at uuea.org, or there is a plate on the bookcase on your way out. Our offertory song was selected by Saladin Allah, Wade in the Water, recorded in 1925 by the Sunset Ford Jubilee Singers.
Wade in the water, gonna come on the water. Angels working at the chariot wheel. God's gonna come on the water. Through the wheel yonder, what I see. God's gonna come on the water. Angels working at the chariot wheel. God's gonna come on the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's gonna come on the water. When I get over on the mountaintop, God's gonna come on the water. Gonna praise my Lord and never stop. God's gonna come on the water. When I get over on the mountaintop, God's gonna come on the water. Gonna praise my Lord and never stop. God's gonna come on the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's gonna come on the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's gonna come on the water.
Our reading today is an excerpt from the Address to the Slaves of the United States, given by Reverend Henry Highland Garnet of Buffalo, New York, at the 1843 National Convention of Free People of Color. Born into slavery in Maryland on December 23, 1815, Henry Highland Garnet escaped from bondage via the Underground Railroad with his parents in 1824. This American abolitionist and clergyman became known for his approach to ending slavery, which is expressed in this speech, also known as a call to rebellion. It is in your power to torment the God-cursed slaveholders that they will be glad to let you go free. If the scale was turned and black men were the masters and white men the slaves, every destructive agent and element would be employed to lay the oppressor low. Danger and death would hang over their heads day and night. Yes, the tyrants would meet with plagues more terrible than those of Pharaoh. But you are a patient people. You act as though you were made for the special use of these devils. You act as though your daughters were born to pamper the lusts of your masters and overseers. And worse than all, you tamely submit while your lords tear your wives from your embraces and defile them before your eyes. In the name of God, we ask, are you men? Where is the blood of your fathers? Has it all run out of your veins? Awake, awake, millions of voices are calling you. Your dead fathers speak to you from their graves. Heaven, as with a voice of thunder, calls you to arise from the dust. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance. No oppressed people have ever secured their liberty without resistance. Saladin Allah comes to us as a visitor experience specialist from the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. The mission of this museum is to reveal authentic stories of freedom seekers and abolitionists in Niagara Falls that will in turn inspire visitors to recognize modern injustices stemming from slavery and to take action toward an equitable society. Saladin is the third great-grandson of famed freedom seeker Josiah Henson, whom Harriet Beecher Stowe used for Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 2018, a permanent life-size display about his family's heritage was included in the Freedom Gallery at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. In 2019, he was the recipient of Niagara Falls Martin Luther King Jr. Civil Rights Achievement Award. In addition to working with the Heritage Center, Saladin is an elementary school educator and a public art coordinator for the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area where he lives. Probably his most important role is that of father of 3 girls. Here is Mr. Saladin Allah, Harriet Tubman, and the Freedom Seekers.
Thank you for that introduction. In regards to the three daughters, you see that I don't have any hair right now, right? First, I'd like to thank all of you for having me here this morning, all of our guests who are online as well. This is a very important time right now that we're experiencing, not only in the world, but this represents the 200-year anniversary of the birth of Harriet Tubman. When we were coordinating this event with Mary, she was telling me about the service on Sunday morning, and she's telling me that the service ends about 11:30. And I was under the impression that I was going to be speaking after the service, but she was like, no, the service is like an hour. So I grew up in a Baptist church, and the altar call to prayer is an hour. Right? And as a part of my culture, the 5%, we have like universal parliaments and rallies where we gather for 4 hours to 6 hours easy. So one of the challenges with just being with you here this morning was to think about, like, how can I succinctly explain the purpose and the role of a figure like Harriet Tubman within this short period of time. She was 5 feet tall, but she was a giant amongst men and women. She was born under the name of Araminta Ross on the eastern seaboard of a plantation in Maryland that was run by a man named Edward Brodess. One of her most earliest experiences in terms of being an enslaved person was at the age of 5 years old, where she began to be leased out to neighboring plantations. So to kind of put that in context for you, here you have a young girl being put in that vulnerable position, in that dangerous situation at the age of 5, which by today's standards would be like our children going to kindergarten. But she's being leased out to plantations to work at the cost of $60 a year, which is equivalent to about $1,700. So that's how she started her life in terms of plantation life. She didn't work on a field, but one of her jobs was she would work inside the homes of enslavers, taking care of babies. So imagine that, a 5-year-old babysitting. And there were many instances where she was punished because the child that she was taking care of wouldn't keep quiet. So if you would imagine, she experienced a lot of abuse at that early age in her life. She also did basket weaving in some of the homes of the enslavers, as well as set muskrat traps on the outside. At one particular point, she became deathly ill and was sent back to her original plantation. But these are the type of jobs that she continuously did in her early life. One incident that she wrote about is when she was about 6 years old, she was in a home of an enslaver, and the enslaver and his mistress got into an argument, and she saw a bowl of sugar over to the side, and she took that as an opportunity because she didn't think that they were paying attention to her. And she stuck her finger in the bowl of sugar because she never had tasted anything sweet before. The mistress saw her do it and beat her so severely that the scars she suffered at 6 years old were scars she had for the rest of her life. This was common amongst people who lived that type of life on plantations. By the time she reached about 12, 13 years old, there was an incident that changed the trajectory of her life. There was a young boy on her plantation that escaped, and her, along with other enslaved people, were instructed to go and capture him. The young boy hid out into a general store that was in proximity to the plantation, and once they arrived there, Minty, as she was affectionately called, went into the store and she was instructed to seize him, which she objected to. She objected so strongly that she got into an argument about not doing the bidding of the enslaver. The young boy looked at this as an opportunity to escape, and as he moved closer to the entrance of the general store, an overseer picked up a 200-pound weight and threw it at the young boy, but missed him and hit her in the head. This incident disabled her for the rest of her life and caused brain trauma to the extent where she suffered epileptic seizures as well as blackouts for the remainder of her life. But this is also the incident that she ascribes to the visions that she started to receive, the visions, the dreams, and what she saw as premonitions from God. Now, to be clear, the God that she was talking about wasn't the white man's God. It wasn't the enslaver's God that was instructing slaves to obey their masters and the gatherings that they held on Sunday mornings in the broad daylight. She was speaking about the God of the invisible institution, the God that her and her people worshiped in the backwoods at night when the enslaver was asleep, the type of God that they prayed to have a poor harvest that year, or that sickness would fall upon the home of the enslaver. This is the God that represented the seedlings of what came to be known as Black liberation theology, the type of God that gave them endurance to live this type of plantation life, the courage to raise up in armed rebellion, as well as the wisdom to actually escape. That was the type of God that she started to get these premonitions from. By the time she turned 22 years old, she got married to a free Black man named John Tubman. Now, prior to this, she was simply affectionately known as Minty. As I mentioned, her birth name was Araminta Ross. But once she got married to John Tubman at the age of 22, she changed her name to Harriet, which was an affectionate name that was connected to her mother. So Harriet, at the age of 22, her premonitions started to become stronger. Also, one thing that was common amongst people who were enslaved is the older that you became, the less valuable you also became. And there were rumblings about her possibly being sold to another plantation. So Harriet took this as an opportunity to make her first escape. And naturally, she shared this with her husband, the free Black man that she was married to. And unfortunately, he refused to actually escape with her to the north. And he didn't just refuse, he also threatened to actually report the fact that she was striving to escape. So under the cover of darkness, she had to escape without her husband even knowing. And in that first time that she escaped at the age of 27, she had her two brothers along her side who also decided to escape. But once they got beyond the outer reaches of the plantation, they didn't have the courage to go further and return back to the plantation. So she made her first journey, her first escape from Maryland to Pennsylvania, over 100 miles by herself. It speaks to the courageousness of a woman to be able to do something like that. By the time she reached her 30s is when she made one of her most historic journeys right here to Western New York. Once she made her first journey when she was 27 years old to Philadelphia, she continued to make journeys back and forth to the South to assist other freedom seekers. On record, we have her aiding and assisting over 70 people in those journeys that she made back and forth to the South. In December of 1856, at the age of 34, is when she made that most notable and heroic journey here to Western New York. She crossed right at the Suspension Bridge, which is in the city of Niagara Falls, riding a train along with a passenger by the name of Josiah Joe Bailey. That wasn't the first time that she crossed into Canada, but it was one of the most heroic and noted journeys that she made right here to Western New York. Now, to put it in context, Western New York itself is one of the richest locations in terms of Underground Railroad heritage. It's right in our backyard. When you think about people making these journeys from the South and reaching Canada, when the Suspension Bridge was constructed in the 1840s and finally completed in 1855, that was the only bridge the only bridge that allowed people safe passage across to the Canadian side. People could walk across, people could catch a carriage across, and they could also ride a train by 1855. That coincided with the construction of the New York Central Railroad here in the state of New York, because prior to that, railroads were mostly local. If you were taking this journey from the South and arrived here in New York State, particularly in Western New York, most of those journeys were traveled on foot. Some of them were traveled on waterways. But once the New York Central Railroad was created, that connected railroads across the state of New York also into neighboring states like Pennsylvania. So during that time, you were able to board a train in Albany, New York City, Philadelphia, and ride that train all the way here to New York State into Western New York. Prior to that, you would have to take those journeys on waterways and on foot. So along with the development of the New York Central Railroad, you had a transportation boom that happened in this area. Not only people traveling here to see the beauty of what we have in this location, but also to seek freedom. Harriet was one of those people that traveled here. Now we can talk about her role as a nurse. She had that background as well. Eventually, when she got in her older age, she established the Harriet Tubman Institution for the Aged, which actually provided assistance to elders and people who were physically and mentally sick for free. This is something that she did in her older age. Auburn, New York is where she eventually settled in 1859. But during the Civil War, Harriet Tubman was the first woman to lead a large military troop in Beaumont, South Carolina. And these troops were 170 in number, and they were successfully able to free over 700 enslaved people. So just thinking about some of the different aspects of who this woman was, it speaks to the multi-dimensions of who she actually is. It's very difficult to really cover her in such a short period of time, but one of the things that I encourage all of you to do who are listening is to do further research on who she was and why she is significant. Many of my people see her as more than just an ancestor, but honor her as one of our matron saints. When she led that military troop to liberate over 700 people in South Carolina, there was a news article that named her the Black She-Moses. And that is one of the names that she carried for the rest of her life. One of the things that I find interesting is teaching Underground Railroad history. I usually get the same type of questions. The questions about the intelligence and the ingenuity of enslaved people. People ask, how did slaves know where to go? How did they know who to talk to and who not to talk to? How did slaves know how to read the actual constellations to determine the direction that they were traveling in? And it's interesting because the same questions that people have about enslaved people are the exact same questions that they have about the people who built the pyramids. Same questions of intelligence and ingenuity. How did they build these megaliths? How did they align these structures with the actual stars? And the key to understanding this is within language. First and foremost, these were not slaves, right? There's a difference than a person being a slave and a person being an enslaved person. There's a difference between a slave and an enslaved person, right? These weren't slaves who had this genius and this intelligence. These were enslaved people. And their history didn't start in enslavement. We're talking about the ascendants, not descendants, because descend means to travel downward or to fall downward. These were the ascendants of the first world people, people who fathered and mothered civilization, who brought the world mathematics and science, and even taught the world about who and what God actually is. That is the genetic link to people who were enslaved. So when you have the question about how were they capable, that was in them. That was their nature, to be able to solve these problems of oppression. And when I mentioned about the invisible institution, some of the language that I'm using are also keys for you to explore. Invisible institution. That Black liberation theology that ran consistently amongst freedom seekers, whether that was Harriet Tubman, whether that was my third great grandfather, the Reverend Josiah Henson, whether that was Frederick Douglass, William Still, any of these freedom seekers, that Black liberation theology that ran consistently throughout these freedom seekers was connected to the stories that you learn about in the Bible, but it was viewed from the perspective of oppressed people. So even though you had people on plantations that couldn't read, the stories that were shared with them, they immediately were able to connect with people of this book who were oppressed from Genesis to Revelations, that were living under the enslavement of the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. It was easy to connect with those people. And that really is what came as the basis of their ability to endure these conditions in slavery, as well as to have the courage to raise up in armed rebellion and the wisdom to be able to escape. This area itself also speaks to the sympathetic residency of the people who actually lived in this place, sort of like this type of congregation that's here in this community. Small population of people who were not just allies, but instigators. You know, when I drove up and I parked and I saw like the structure and I'm looking around at the other houses in the community, I drove into the parking lot and I'm like, okay, this is the home of the instigators in the community. You know, these are people who are proactive in their approach to making sure that there's a sense of equity and social justice. That's what's necessary. When we talk about the Underground Railroad, we're talking about the first human rights movement in this country. Part resistance movement, but also the first human rights movement. And there were always people who were a part of that were diverse. Small in number, the same way that you may be small in number within this community, but that is what was necessary to move the movement forward. You think about movements such as the Underground Railroad or the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of times you hear a lot of myths, right? I heard a myth recently that there was some woman that taught Harriet Tubman how to recognize a North Star. I'm like, can Black people just have something to ourselves, you know? And you oftentimes have people who feel as if they have to constantly inject themselves into the narrative. You know, the same thing with what I mentioned about the building of the pyramids. You know, it's obvious who built the pyramids. Egypt is in the middle of Africa. Egypt means the land of the burnt faces. The original name of Egypt is Kemet, which means the black land, and it's not talking about soil. But yet, when you look at the iconography and the images and stuff, you see people who don't look like they're from Egypt at all. Or with the archaeological findings and stuff, and even the stone reliefs that show you who the Egyptians actually are. Some people will look at that and they're so committed to their ideology of white supremacy that if they can't say they did it, they're going to say ancient aliens did it. Now, I haven't heard the ancient aliens theory with the Underground Railroad yet, but I'm sure it's coming somewhere in the future with the myths that are shared about what's going on, right? So a part of this process and this journey of education is also unlearning a lot of the things that we were taught about ourselves and about each other. And this focus on the bicentennial of Harriet Tubman is a good starting point in terms of learning a little bit more about an extraordinary woman who did things that were beyond human capacity. And I speak to the ability to do things beyond human capacity because it also gives you insight into the type of God that enslaved people were connected to. Not that white man's God, but the God that they reached into their inner recesses and connected with, that allowed them to have the wisdom, strength, and beauty to not just endure, not just to display resilience, but to be evidence even today as what is known as anti-fragility. You know, for those of you who are not familiar with anti-fragility, if you were to break a bone, usually that bone heals and becomes stronger than what it originally was. That's who I represent in terms of my people who traveled here to the wilderness of North America and who went through the Great Mayafo or the transatlantic slave trade and worked on those plantations in the South and eventually escaped. Now, to speak a little bit more about my own family, Josiah Henson was the lead narrative that was used in Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a best-selling novel of the 19th century. When she wrote that book, there was a lot of people who disagreed with the narrative that she was putting into the public domain because a lot of people, especially up north, didn't really know about the horrors that was happening in slavery. She actually illustrated that in the book. Copyright laws are not the same as they were during that time, so you had a lot of other books being put out to discredit Harriet Beecher Stowe, plays that people begin to create to discredit her, newspaper articles demonizing her. So she wrote a second book right short after she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in that book, she cites all of her references and research and resources, and she mentions my third great-grandfather, Josiah Henson, by name in 3 different passages, stating that he was the primary source that she used because his autobiography was circulating amongst abolitionists reading circles. And that's how she learned about who he was. He escaped the plantation in September of 1830. Now, to kind of put it in context, as I mentioned, Harriet Tubman was born in 1822. So she was 8 years old, and she was known as Minty at the time that he escaped at 41 years old with his entire family. 4 children, 2 were so small he had to carry him in a knapsack on his back. And he traveled from Kentucky and walked over 300 miles to a place known as Sandusky, Ohio, where he was able to successfully board a ship with his family that was captained by a man named John Burnham. The ship was called the Schooner Commerce, and that took him from Sandusky, Ohio, and his family up to Buffalo, New York, where they docked and were able to successfully cross over to the Canadian side in Fort Erie. This journey took a month. Journeys like this oftentimes take months because you got to keep in mind that people weren't traveling in daylight. They had to hide under the cover of darkness. At the same time, they had to consider the landscape that they have never seen before, as well as a plant life and animal life. It takes a lot of intelligence and ingenuity to be able to navigate these spaces and to connect with people in these strategic locations who would aid them by providing temporary shelter, food, and clothing. It was an extraordinary, network, and the same type of network that we need today. So one of the things that I would like to do is to invite all of you out to our Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. By show of hands, who has been there already? You've been there already? Okay, cool. We have what is called signature freedom conversation tours at our space. Now, typically when you go to a museum space, they have docents that show you everything and do all of the talking, and you just nod your head and go along. We don't do that at our Underground Railroad Heritage Center. Our goal is to create a safe space so that we can connect with one another and immerse ourselves in these stories of everyday people who are doing extraordinary things, such as Harriet Tubman. The location of our Heritage Center is literally right outside the location where the suspension bridge was actually constructed. So you're going to be only feet from where Harriet Tubman crossed over 150 years ago. So I would like to conclude by just putting forth this call to action that it's not enough to just really learn about, Harriet Tubman and, to feel warm and fuzzy inside to celebrate her 200-year bicentennial. It's important to strive to connect with her, from where you are. I'm not saying that you have to start a home like she did for the elderly and, the people who are mentally and physically sick and take care of them for free. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is continuing to do this type of work, finding other things that you can do to be even more proactive, because there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of work to be done. And especially as people who are classified as white, you got a lot of work with your people. So in closing, I would like to open up for, any questions that you would have in regards to what I've shared this morning. And again, I want to thank all of you for being here with us this morning. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
Where is it located in Niagara Falls?
So the address is 820. The location of our Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center is 825 Depot Avenue West. It's on the north end of our city, and it's connected to our Amtrak station. Mm-hmm. And it's actually inside of a historic building that was a customs house of the 1860s. So any of you who are into architecture, you get a chance to see a building that's been here for quite some time. Do I have any questions on Zoom? Okay. Yes, ma'am. So her question was, did freedom seekers who traveled across to the Canadian side leave any writings or evidence of how they were treated over on the Canadian side? Yes, they did. And one of the things that I conclude from their treatment is that it was equivalent to racism with a manicure. Right? It wasn't as nasty and in your face oftentimes that they experienced here on the American side, but they definitely experienced racism. You had a lot of people who were Canadian that were xenophobic, and they didn't want these people here, right? My ancestor, you spoke of St. Catherine's. Josiah Henson, when he traveled across the Canadian side, he temporarily lived in a community called Little Africa, which was a freedom seeker settlement right in Fort Erie across from the Peace Bridge. When people crossed into the Canadian side, freedom seeker settlements were established as safe havens for people once they crossed. So you had those type of settlements in St. Catherine's, Mississauga, Toronto, Dresden, Niagara-on-the-Lake. You had them in all different places because people understood that freedom wasn't an individual thing, but I had to help perpetuate this network of freedom by doing what I can in order to establish that type of safe haven for people who arrived here. So you had people that, such as Harriet Tubman, that would go back and forth into the United States and assist others as a conductor. A conductor of the Underground Railroad is someone who actually travels with you and takes you from place to place. Not everybody played that role. Some people traveled across to the Canadian side and never set foot in America again, but they were still connected to their people by creating these freedom seeker settlements. Josiah Henson, after he lived temporarily in Little Africa, he convinced the community leaders to come together and purchase land to establish their own community because Little Africa was on Canadian government soil. And he really didn't see the self-determination that he wanted to fully express and for his people to fully experience. So they commissioned him to find land that he thought was suitable, and he went further north to a place that was called Dawn at that time. and was able to successfully purchase over 200 acres of land to reestablish what came to be known as the Dawn Settlement, where over 180 freedom seekers resettled. He was also instrumental in building the British American Institute, and he led a black militia during the rebellion of 1837. He also came back and forth into the United States in the role of an abolitionist. Through his family, his daughter lived in St. Catharines, and my grandmother, Inez Dorsey, was born through his daughter. So she lived in that same community in St. Catharines that Harriet Tubman's family also lived in. She moved over here to the United States in 1925. She had several children. My father was one of those children. And then my father had several children, and I'm one of the most attractive and intelligent of those 7 children. So there are countless stories about the way that freedom seekers were treated by living over on the Canadian side, you know.
And what would you say overall about that? When you say with a manager, what are you saying?
That Malcolm X, he said it best. He said that if Southerners were equivalent to a canine, in the South, they bit you with a growl, but up north, they bite you with a smile. So their experience was a more passive-aggressive racism. You know, it was more on the form of, oh no, we just don't have anything available. I'm sorry, there's nothing that we can do about it. As opposed to, we don't want you here, right? Where there were certain opportunities that just, you know, they just are not available. I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do about it, right? Even to this day, you know, you still see that type of experience over on the Canadian side. But it was far better than the experience that many of us had here in North America in terms of this part of North America, the United States. What would be the next biggest thing to move us towards racial justice? Teaching children. Teaching children. We have to create early childhood learning spaces where we are invested in children to become the adults that we would like to see. Because if you think about it, all of the problems that we see that are going on, that's not children. These are adults that are causing these problems. And these adults at one point were children. So at all times, it doesn't matter what movement it is, it doesn't matter how progressive we say that it has to start in our children. We have to teach them the right way because this world is eventually going to be theirs. And we want to make sure that they're the type of citizens that are going to bring more beauty to this world as opposed to continuing to see the things that are broken. As an educator, I'm just always an advocate for children. And, you know, you might see that my disposition is a little light. You know, I smile a lot because I'm around children every day. Every day. So I have an opportunity to see the hope in their eyes. I see it every single day. And I see the possibility in them. So if you're ever feeling down, if you're ever feeling depressed, if you ever feel as if I don't know where to start, invest some time around some children. They will give you some perspective on your infinite potential as well as your ability to meet challenges. Mm-hmm. Of all the people who reached Canada, was there ever a proportion of them who returned back to the United States? Absolutely. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, which freed people on paper at least, because you can't legislate people's attitudes, there were a lot of freedom seekers who returned in mass back to the United States to reconnect with their families. You know, one thing that was rare about Josiah Henson's journey is that he took his whole family with him. That was usually unheard of. most times people had to escape by themselves or in ones or twos, and they usually never were able to take their entire family, especially because slavery separated a lot of families. And sometimes you had no clue where your child was sold or where your brothers and sisters or other family members were actually sold. So people took that as an opportunity to strive to find and search for and reconnect with their families once slavery was abolished on paper here in the United States. So the same way when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850 and people made an exodus out of the United States to get to freedom on the Canadian side because that federal law didn't apply there, once the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, you also had an exodus to people coming back into the United States to find and reconnect with their families.
They had gone back to Canada with their families once they found them?
Absolutely, because by 1834, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. So that emancipation was also something that was attractive to people to go to the Canadian side. In Niagara Falls itself, you had people who lived on the Canadian side and would travel back and forth over into the United States. You know, keep in mind, there weren't customs at that time prior to the 1860s, so people weren't checking passports. You know, you would have to pay a toll to get across to the Canadian side, whether you took that journey across on a rowboat or a steamship or taking the suspension bridge, but people consistently went back and forth from the Canadian side to the American side. I'm only 47 years old, and even in my lifetime, my family and other families in the city of Niagara Falls of our African-American community would consistently go over across to the Canadian side to celebrate the emancipation of slavery on the Canadian side. We call it Emancipation Day. Even to this day, we have those celebrations on the Canadian side that us on the American side go over and collaboratively celebrate with our people on the Canadian side. I have any other questions? Okay. Thank you again for just being here this morning. And like I mentioned, use this as an opportunity to learn a little more and to find out what you can do to do more than what you are actually doing. And like I mentioned, come in here into this space. I can see the work that you're already doing. And you need to celebrate that because there's a lot of spaces that are not like this. You know, there's a space in Niagara Falls. We have a Unitarian Universalist church in Niagara Falls right on the south end of our city. But there's not a lot of spaces like this. So you should celebrate the work that you're doing and continue in that work and bringing more children into this as well. Thank you.
Please join me for the extinguishing of the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Our closing words are from another great woman in U.S. history, civil rights and anti-lynching activist and educator Mary Burnett Talbert. The greatness of nations is shown by their strict regard for human rights, rigid enforcement of the law without bias, and just administration of the affairs of life.